Some of y'all Attack on Titan fans despise that Armin and Annie got together in the end. And I get it. Why should Annie, who killed thousands of innocent people, deserve to be with the hero Armin, who killed thousands of innocent people? So I did a deep dive into the two characters and realized something. Not only does this shit make sense, it's thematically perfect. The key to understanding their relationship is to not view it as an isolated plot point, but instead to view it side by side with Eren and Mikasa's. It becomes clear that their stories are much more symbolically intertwined than one would expect, and that the parallels between them are used to explore a key theme of Attack on Titan, that the world is beautiful enough to justify its suffering. I'm going to explain Eren and Mikasa's relationship, juxtapose it with Armin and Annie, and by the end convince you that Armin and Annie getting together was a fantastic addition to the story. The foundation of Annie's love for Armin is the same as Mikasa's for Eren. Armin offers the antidote to Annie's nihilistic view of the world, as does Eren for Mikasa. Let's break down Mikasa and Eren's relationship, and use it to explain the connection between the best two blondes in the story. Yeah, that's right, I said it. As a child, Mikasa realized that the world is cruel. She first noticed this when she saw a bug being beheaded and eaten by a grasshopper. It taught her a harsh truth about reality. Life is a cycle of death, where life forms have to kill and consume other life forms to sustain themselves. Predators have to kill prey, prey has to kill plants. Even some plants are killing things. Y'all ever seen a Venus flytrap? It wasn't easy for any of us to learn this truth, because when we realize everything on this planet dies, we have to accept that we and our loved ones are going to die too. We don't know when or how, but there's no escaping the fact that the conscious experience we have of the world will one day stop happening. Mikasa observed this truth, but she had a loving family that brought her happiness and delayed the urgency of answering this existential question. That is, until she didn't have a family anymore. Her mom and dad were brutally murdered. They died a horrific death for no good reason, and the way the kidnappers chatted about it so casually revealed to her an even darker truth. The world wasn't just ripe with death, it also contained something called evil, which actively pushes forward to bring about that death and pain to people who don't deserve it. Not for survival like animals, but for pleasure and greed. In a split second, the most precious thing to Mikasa's world, her mother and her father, was torn apart by the reality of death, by the pure malevolence of her kidnappers, and she was next. Her only option was to give up. The world was simply too painful, and there was nothing left to live for. At only 9 years of age, she concluded that life simply takes everything you love away from you and brings you nothing but wickedness in return. Now hold up. Y'all who came to this video hoping for a simple ship analysis might be having a little existential crisis right now, and that's intentional, because you're experiencing what Mikasa felt in that moment. But there was a remedy to this crisis coming towards Mikasa, and his name was Eren Yeager. Eren gave Mikasa two antidotes to the tragedy of evil and death. The first antidote is to fight. You can fight back against evil. And that's what he did. He killed two of her kidnappers, and he cried out a phrase that stuck in her heart for the rest of her life. If you win, you live. If you lose, you die. If you don't fight, you can't win. Mikasa's despair was replaced with courage, because she discovered that it's possible to face the world's suffering head on. She didn't have to give up so easily. This got her back on her feet. She killed the third kidnapper, but when the chaos ended, Mikasa's cold depression she felt after her parents died returned. And of course it did. Because this antidote on its own isn't enough to justify existence. Who cares how sweet revenge feels if despair is so bitter? But this is where Eren gives her the second antidote to death and evil. The second antidote is the beauty in the world that makes life worth living. This is symbolized by Eren wrapping a scarf around Mikasa, an act that physically and metaphorically protected her from the coldness of the natural world. On the outset, this act seems trivial and sort of meaningless. I mean, as kind as it is, how is a scarf enough to console a person who just had their parents murdered? And yet it was enough. Even with its simplicity and smallness of scale, to Mikasa the scarf expressed the very depths of life's magnificence, where even a small act of love can be enough to keep going in a world beset by death. This defines her character. Mikasa loves Eren, and some people criticize her for being too attached, but her attachment is the same thing we are all rightfully attached to. We move forward because even if we don't feel it at this moment, we know deep down there's something transcendentally beautiful within the mystery of life that can make our suffering worth it. And when that transcendent beauty can be realized in a person, or given to a person, we call that love. Mikasa and Eren's relationship is incredible on its own, but Isayama decided to have a subsequential love story with Armin and Annie, and unlike Eren and Mikasa, these characters likely got a happier ending. Why is that? It's time for some parallels. With a close read, it's clear that Annie and Armin's love story has deep symbolic connections to Eren and Mikasa's. It also has a few intentional differences that mean a lot to the characters and to the story itself. Annie too grapples with the feeling that life is meaningless and cruel. Just like Mikasa, we the viewers watch her recognize this feeling when she notices a dead bug, rather than Mikasa's grasshopper beheading its prey. This bug was stomped on by Annie, a nod to how each of them kill. Speaking of killing, the first intentional difference between Annie and Mikasa's relationship is how they first came to realize the darker side of existence. Mikasa discovered this cruelty of the world by witnessing the evil that was in front of her, like the utter wickedness of her kidnappers. But Annie discovered this cruelty by acknowledging the evil within herself. Annie hurts others, and recognizes how hurting others can be used to get what you want. From there, she could reason how the evil within her also exists outside of her, and that's just how life is. To Annie, her own self is just as worthless as the world around her. It was absolutely necessary that Isayama incorporated Annie's perspective to complement Mikasa, because together, they present a full picture of the human experience. The world is cruel, but so are we. We are weak and fragile, but by knowing our own vulnerabilities, we exploit the vulnerabilities of others. The only way to justify this tragedy is to hold on to the light, the antidotes to suffering that make life bearable amidst the darkness. Annie is taught the first antidote, to fight, at a young age. She isn't inspired by this like Mikasa was, because Annie was only trained to fight for her adoptive father's benefit. Annie never had a loving family to mourn the loss of, or a knight in shining armor like Eren. She never even got to love in the first place. And so as Annie got better at fighting, she didn't find hope in it like Mikasa. Instead, her worldview got even darker. That's because without something worth fighting for, winning could do nothing but reaffirm her belief that she was a bad person. This is until her adoptive father repents of his actions and tells Annie he wants her to come back alive. For the first time ever, Annie encounters the transcendental beauty in life, a person who loves her. And so just like Mikasa, she clings on to love to keep going. Like she explained to Hitch and others pretty clearly, she would stop at nothing to see her adoptive father again. But while Mikasa always had Eren by her side, except for when, he got kidnapped every season, Annie's chances of finding this transcendental beauty ever again was slim. Stuck in paradise for years, she was grasping at straws, causing mayhem to the Survey Corps and still not being able to finish her mission and go home. Love wasn't an attainable goal for her. She was trapped in the cruelty of the world, the cruelty she brought into the world, in Marley's malevolent military agenda that put her an island away from her adoptive father. Even though she had a glimpse of the antidote to life's cruelty, she had lost it and was back to square one. As she's captured by the scouts, Annie is stuck in a situation of pure hopelessness, symbolized by literally being stuck in a crystal. She remains there for years, in agony and boredom. Yet like Mikasa, Annie receives a simple act of kindness that changes her world. Armin talking to her when she's crystallized. In parallel to Mikasa's situation, this act seems trivial and useless. Hearing Armin narrate the entire AOT story isn't going to get her out of the crystal. But even this tiny act of love touches her deeply, saving her from the insanity of being all alone during her 4 years in a crystallized rock. It's a revelation of how the goodness and hope of the world, even in its smallest instances, is so much more powerful compared to the darkness. Goodness doesn't need to change your life situation. It can simply make your current situation bearable. When she's free from the crystal, she of course still hopes to return to her father, but she begins to realize that there is someone else in this world that makes life worth living, and his name is Armin Arlert. Notice how even though her dad taught her to fight, and gave her a glimpse of love, it is Armin who uniquely brings this message to fruition in her life. She is no longer left with a small thread of hope. She can now grapple with the fact that the world has other people worth living for. Their love story doesn't blossom exclusively from this moment. The dialogue they have on the boat is critical to their relationship and her character development. Annie invites Armin to sit and thanks him for talking to her all of those years. Out of her insecurity, she asks Armin why he talked to her when he probably had other girls. For the first time, we see a soft and feminine version of Annie, who was blushing and asking loaded questions like a teenage girl. It's not the cold-hearted Annie we're used to. Her internal walls are lowered, and we see a glimpse of the delicate girl she truly is. The girl she could have always been if it wasn't for the bloodshed. Armin nervously confesses that he wanted to see her in particular, revealing that he has feelings for her over other girls. After blushing and getting nervous, she puts her walls back up and deflects the conversation by bringing up the fact that there's a genocide going on, and how meaningless it is to talk about these matters while everyone is dying. Her deflection is a quick reminder of the dilemma we all encounter in trying to find beauty in a cruel world. Is it fair to enjoy good things amidst so much pain? Annie then copes by concluding that the real reason Armin was by her side all of those years is because he's a good person, or because there was a strategic benefit to growing close to the female titan. She gets up and starts to walk away. Armin grabs her hand and explains that he doesn't want to be called a good person. He acknowledges his own sin of killing innocent people, and reveals his hope that even though the world isn't what it turned out to be in his book, he still believes there's a world out there he doesn't know about yet, beyond the walls. This conversation is more than a cute confession in the middle of global omnicide. This conversation directly tackles the two key conflicts within Annie's character. First, Armin confronts Annie's self-hatred, which is the root of her cruel view of life. He makes clear that she as a person means something to him, and like her father, he cares for her beyond strategic or moral reasons. This point is critical to the theme of finding beauty in a dark existence, because we aren't only battling darkness externally, we battle it internally as we contend with the evil within us. To resolve this, Annie admits his own sin to shoulder the pain with her, and offers reconciliation to heal her inner brokenness, all for the chance of a deeper connection between them. This internal catharsis is something Annie and Armin's relationship uniquely serves to highlight, and it contrasts to Mikasa and Erin's dynamic, which centers on battling the cruelty that others inflict upon us. Second, in this conversation, Armin confronts Annie's discouragement in ever finding joy again. As mentioned earlier, Annie is trapped in despair because all her efforts to return to her father, her one hope of finding love in this world, failed miserably. Annie was always separated from her father during the story, whereas Mikasa had Eren by her side. Annie therefore holds on to a worldview that Mikasa doesn't, which is that even if there is beauty in this world, it is simply too difficult to obtain for life to be worth living. The Rumbly doesn't help with that, since from her POV, her adoptive dad was probably already dead. Armin's remarks about his childhood book and his belief in an undiscovered world beyond the walls matters tremendously here, because it is a call for Annie to keep pushing forward to find the good, no matter how hopeless things may seem. That call to keep looking is more than a nudge of encouragement. It is the cry of all humanity that sustained us for generations against the reality of death. From this point on, it becomes even clearer that they have feelings, and a relationship starts to blossom. We're reminded of this during scenes like when Annie hilariously asks how Armin is doing before asking for peak status. Same with her interaction with Mikasa, which is top-tier comic relief in a dark part of the story. The parallels and themes mentioned above are powerful enough to justify Isayama's decision to put them together, but there's one last thing we need to address for why this love story is so thematically satisfying. Armin and Annie fall in love, and their love story is Isayama's way to further explore the dichotomy of cruelty and beauty. Yet it's important to note that Armin and Annie are allowed to survive the story, but Mikasa has to let go of Eren. The reason why is crucial to complete the point Isayama is trying to make through these two relationships, and that is that Armin held on to the worldview that saved Annie and Mikasa, while Eren didn't. I haven't talked about Eren much, but his departure from Armin's worldview speaks depths to the story's message. Armin believes that despite the cruelty of the world, the small instances of beauty make it worthwhile. His conversation with Zeke demonstrates this, as in response to Zeke's belief that life has no purpose but to multiply, Armin brings up the simplest acts of joy, like running towards a tree, that are precious enough for him to keep going. Again, the antidote to evil, which comes off as massive and complex, is beauty, which comes off as simple and small. Eren didn't accept this truth, and instead thought the world needed to be destroyed and rebuilt before he could find fulfillment. Aaron interpreted life's cruelty as the barrier to freedom, blocking a state of being where he could finally grasp the totality of life's existence without external constraints. His dream for a new world without limitations caused him to rage against reality, because reality demands limitations. It demands enemies. And so he tried to wipe away everything with genocide. Mikasa had to decide between sticking with Eren in an act substantially more evil than the murder of her own parents, or stopping him at the price of losing her source of hope in life. She chose to let Eren go, while still loving him and being grateful for all that he did. Eren's unending quest to fix reality was his downfall, and it stemmed from his inability to find joy in what was already in front of him. His grandiose visions to bend reality to his will failed, made him miserable, and brought literal hell on Earth. This is Isayama's warning to the reader. If you keep running around trying to change everything in your life, you will never be able to appreciate what you already have. Armin poetically expresses this truth by holding a shell in paths and saying to Eren,
やっと気づいてくれたのか。いつでも足元にあったのに。いつも遠くばかり見てるから。
Eren could only look off into the distance, and so he could never have the future with Mikasa, which was at his feet the whole time. Eren couldn't handle the world without destroying it, and so he couldn't remain in the world where Mikasa's love awaited him. But Armin could handle the world, not because he was strong and powerful, but because even in his weakness, he always tried to find goodness in the worst of people and the worst of situations. He made peace with reality, which allowed him to live with hope in a world destined to die. In particular, his profound gratitude rewarded him the chance to have what was at his feet, a future with a girl named Annie, and he could be the one to mend her brokenness and shatter the rock of despair that trapped her for years. He completes her character arc by becoming the hope she saw in her father, a man who encourages her to live in a world that seems unlivable. We too are called to make the world feel livable to the people around us. Recognize that you are a gift to the world, and you have the wonderful potential to bring an antidote to suffering others desperately need. It doesn't matter how hopeless our present situation seems. Strive to bring the transcendental beauty of God's love into this cruel world in simple but profound ways. Take someone out to an aquarium, volunteer at a homeless shelter, reply to the Insta story of a person you used to talk to and ask how their life's going. Go to a church young adult group and listen to a stranger's life story like it's the most important thing in the world. Decide on something right now and promise you'll do it this week no matter what. This is your weapon to rebel against death. Reality doesn't need to be destroyed and rebuilt. It simply needs you. Because even your small acts of love are enough to remind the rest of us that this world may be cruel, but it is also beautiful.